I'm going to go over some stuff real quick. And obviously, you can get a lot more in depth on plant control once you're down to species. But for the sake of our 10 to 20 minutes that we have here, I'm not going to get too in depth on species because learning all aquatic plant species in Iowa could take you well over a year. So I'm going to just go over the highlights of some of the main plants, some of the main algae problems we have. And if you have more concerns, we can dig deeper after that. So I'm going to go over the good and the bad. Aquatic plants are good, both emergent and submerged and floating plants. They're all good, with exception to when they achieve high abundances and biomass in your pond is when you would most likely need to do some sort of a management activity. Some of the benefits of these aquatic plants is they do provide good water quality. They use up some of those nutrients that come into the system and provide you some clear water, but then they also can provide dissolved oxygen when they're photosynthesizing. So they also provide fish habitat. A lot of young of the year fish will live in beds of pondweed species. They'll also seek shade out of some of the floating plants. So floating pondweeds, some of the water lilies. They also can reduce algae. Same reason we've talked about these nutrients coming into a system all morning. If the plants are in that system and well established, they can use those nutrients and reduce your amount of different types of algal blooms you can have. And then a lot of those emergent plants can actually reduce your erosion on your shoreline. And when you get that wave action beating on the shoreline, if you have some cattails, obviously in moderation, arrowhead species in moderation, those are good species to have there on the shoreline to reduce that erosion. But as always, in Iowa, we can grow a lot of aquatic vegetation and algae. So what you're going to see is if you have a high abundance of aquatic vegetation or algae, you're going to see low dissolved oxygen concentrations in the morning, because as those plants create oxygen during the day, at night they're using oxygen. And sometimes if you have too much of a good thing, you'll wind up with very, very low dissolved oxygen readings in the morning. Also, you can have access issues. All aquatic plants can hinder access to a system. It could be an angler simply not being able to walk to the edge of the shoreline because of a pretty extensive cattail stand. But also if you have a lot of pondweeds in your plant, sago pondweed, narrowleaf pondweed species in your pond, you can't actually fish the pond. You can't present a lure to a fish to even catch it. And then lastly, your fish population, as Tyler touched on, trying to get that fish population is one of the harder challenges of pond ownership or managing a pond. That predator-prey relationship can become out of balance if you have too much vegetation. And we're always trying to, target that 20 to 30% of your lake be vegetated to maintain a healthy fish population. All right, Tyler, go ahead. All right, so we have 3 different control methods available to us when we're dealing with aquatic plants. The first one is mechanical. This is a harvester or a cutter cutting. You'll notice that mechanical harvester there on the right side in Carter Lake. That's really not practical on a large lake system, but there are ways you can mechanically remove vegetation from a small pond. You can try to rake it out with a large metal rake. There's also products called weed razors that you can adjust the angle and swath of what the material it could cut, and you can throw it out and cut that material. And the other thing, in some farm ponds in the past, landowners have taken old box springs, ripped all the material off it, and then they'll attach rope or chain to it and drag it from the shoreline in with most likely a tractor or some piece of equipment to clear that vegetation. The one thing about mechanical, a lot of our different methods is you have to do it multiple times. Mechanical is simply like mowing the grass. So if you understand that you're going to do mechanical removal and you build yourself a schedule, it can be an effective way to create access to the pond. I put biological on here, but we don't have a whole lot of recommendations for biological at this time. Insect control is used on some of our invasive aquatic plants, but it has been marginal in success at best and very hard to get any sort of real management, attainable management using insects. Grass carp is an option for private landowners. The one thing that I would caution you is please use triploid grass carp and go at a very, very low stocking density, but most likely much lower than what the people selling the grass carp are telling you. And the last option is often the option more frequently used is chemical. So this would be aquatic herbicides, which we roughly have 15 to 17 different chemical compounds listed for use in the United States. Then we also have some of the complex copper algicides, and then we have surfactants that we can use with those products. And then we also have shading products that would just simply dye your water and also reduce that light transmission to the sediment for plant germination or algae growth. All right, Tyler. So one thing I want to mention, if we're going to talk about chemical control, because more, like I said, more frequently, this is the control that we go with. Some considerations I want folks to be thinking about if you're going down the road of, I think I have a plant that needs managed. I'm going to go the route of an aquatic herbicide. The number one thing to get figured out is what plant are you actually dealing with? Because the species of plant depends on what aquatic herbicide is going to be best suited for your needs, not only which one's going to be more effective, but which one's more cost effective, because there's many different products that will manage certain species, but there's in the situation, some products are much cheaper than others. And that's where getting that plant properly ID'd is incredibly important. The selection of herbicide based on your goals, again, I'm going to highlight 2 aquatic herbicides here because they're the ones most frequently used in situations by small pond owners. That is Reward. That is a trade name. The active ingredient in that is diquat. There are generics to Reward. And the other one is Aquathol K. These are both good broad spectrum herbicides. One of them, Reward, is an actual contact herbicide. So you'll see rather quick management of a plant. The other one, Aquathol, is more systemic. So you will do a treatment and see control in upwards of 2 to 3 weeks as that chemical compound works its way through the plant. Another thing to take in consideration is the timing of application. A lot of you are managing small ponds, and the timing of application early in the day, sunny for contact herbicides is incredibly important. But I also want you to think about early in the season. For most species, some species you need to realize if you're going to be managing cattails, late in the summer, early fall is the best time to be spraying cattails, because that's when they're moving all of their carbohydrates down to the rhizome, and that's when you're going to get a longer term management out of your activity. But also in some of your smaller ponds, and you're going to try to get ahead of, say, curly leaf pondweed, you'll want to go really early in the season as it's growing much earlier than other plants. And then for other reasons, if you're going to manage sago pondweed, which grows all summer, you'll want to get ahead of it before it achieves 80% of your pond's volume. So those are some things to keep in kind of mind, as not only the timing of day for the plant control, timing of year for the control, but then also you're managing a small system, and you have a less flexibility in how much you can treat at one time than we do on larger systems. So something to keep in mind. We're going to want a period of no rain, because you don't want your chemical to wash out based on your watershed size. You're going to want low wind conditions, so you have less herbicide drift. And then one thing I always try to urge pond owners is utilize free software like Google Maps, so that you actually know you're treating a half acre or a third of an acre, because that makes a big difference on the amount of herbicide you would use. So you would be following your label for calculating those treatments, and you know your actual area that you would be treating. Then one thing I would recommend is you keep your records for up to 3 years, just in case. Keep record of what you did and keep those records on hand for up to 3 years. All right, Tyler. So I'm just going to go into some common plants here that we see folks have problems with. I'm going to break them down by submersed, floating, and emergent plants, and then we'll talk about algae at the very end of the conversation here. So submersed plants that we see folks having the most problems with in small ponds is curly-leaf pondweed. This is a non-native plant. It starts growing in September and October, and you're managing it in April and May. Some of the other species are narrow-leaf pondweeds, and I'll go into a couple of the actual names, but as long as you know it's a narrow-leaf pondweed, you would also that helps you determine what chemicals you can use, because some of our narrow-leaf pondweeds are a little hardier in terms of resistance to herbicide. And then coontail, it's a very common plant that is controlled in many systems across Iowa. Then floating plants, duckweed and watermeal, often confused for algae, and copper, complex copper compounds will not control duckweed and watermeal. Those are two of the hardest plants to control in our systems, and most often the most expensive to control in our systems. And then lastly, emergent plants, cattails, lotus, and water lilies. And then algae. Okay, Tyler. All right, so the submerged plants, curly-leaf pondweed. This plant is on the right there. The number one thing here is if you have a plant in April in your pond and it's almost to the surface in April and May, odds are this is probably a strong candidate for what you're dealing with. Like I said, this plant germinates in September, October, and November, and then it goes dormant throughout the winter under the ice. And then in the spring, as soon as the ice comes off, it's already established itself at 6 to 18 inches in height, and it starts growing immediately. It has a very characteristic lasagna-like noodle, lasagna-like leaf, and those leaves are alternate on the stem. It's a unique looking plant. It is susceptible, the good thing about it, to low concentrations of almost every herbicide we use. And there are now small pond owners that are treating this under the ice with some more unique systemic herbicides, and they would do not have to do that control in the spring when the ice comes off. The one thing about curly-leaf pondweed in a pond is if you have a pond that is dominated by curly-leaf pondweed in the spring, you probably have algae bloom issues in the summer after that curly-leaf pondweed senesces or dies back. What happens is those plants die back in June and July. They release all those nutrients into the water column. They've often crowded out that lake bottom for sunlight, so no other native plants are growing to take up those nutrients. So the only thing left to use those nutrients are more frequently algae species. Okay, Tyler. So one of the more challenging species of plants to manage, and I'm just going to put this as Potamogeton. There are over 12 species of narrow-leaf Potamogetons in Iowa. They all behave similarly, and as far as their growth, some of them become more problematic with abundance levels versus others, but they all have a little bit, they're a little bit hardier to some of our typical algae treatments. And we would typically be mixing an active herbicide with a complex copper now. We have a new copper available called comine. And when you mix that comine with that reward or diquat product, we're seeing pretty good success on these narrow-leaf pondweed species across the board than just simply doing a reward treatment with a surfactant or an aquathol treatment with nothing else. We're really seeing a good combination of that diquat with comine mixture to gain control on a lot of these narrow-leaf pondweed species. Tyler, you can advance me. And coontail, this is, I mean, I think everybody has coontail somewhere in their pond. Oftentimes this one gets confused for Eurasian water milfoil, one of our non-natives. Thankfully, 95% of our private pond calls that think they have Eurasian water milfoil, which I'm glad they call and want to get confirmation on that, but 95% of those wind up being coontail. Coontail is a challenging plant. It does achieve incredibly high biomass. But the one thing about it, it is very susceptible to almost all of our compounds of herbicide, as well as some of our simple complex coppers. If you're doing an algae treatment anyway, a lot of time that complex copper compound is incredibly effective on coontail alone. So a problematic plant, but a lot of choices when dealing with it, and all those choices have a lot to do with your pond. Okay, next slide. All right, so this is that duckweed and water meal. You're going to notice this looks like algae. Often, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on how to manage this one because that's more of a that's a 10 to 15-minute phone call with different chemical compounds you can use. It's very expensive to control these two species, but these are actually the smallest aquatic plants that you will find, and they are free floating. One has a visible root that you can see, and that's on the duckweed, which is that plant on the left. That is a larger of the two species. And then on the right, you'll see watermeal, which is actually our smallest flowering aquatic plant that we have. You almost need a microscope to see the flower. But both of these species are highly, highly resistant to some of our herbicides and require some of our most expensive herbicides in our toolbox to control. Next slide. So we're going to get into some of the more emergent plants. So cattails, I'll also include arrowhead in here since we've talked about that already today. These are always good to have on your shoreline. I would prefer to have arrowhead over cattails because cattails tend to spread rather quickly, and control of them is rather intensive if you have a large stand. And there's many chemicals available to control it. The one thing I would mention about cattails, there's been some recent control efforts up in Minnesota on cattails where you're not using herbicide, but you have a unique situation where your cattails may be in 1 to 2 foot of water and they're flooded. You can cut those plants off below the surface, 2 to 3 inches below the surface. And as long as you're not losing water rapidly, that will suffocate that plant and you'll get yearly control if you do that. If you have too dense of a stand, unfortunately, one of your only options is your aquatic labeled glyphosates or a safer product that folks tend to go towards more. CPRO makes a product called ClearCast that works really well. And again, timing is incredibly important when dealing with cattails and arrowhead. If you are going to manage arrowhead, is targeting that late summer, early fall application. That way those plants have depleted their resources with reproduction that year. They're trying to pull all their resources back to their rhizome, and at the same time, you would be hitting them with a systemic herbicide that goes down into the rhizome, and you'll gain longer term control doing that. Earlier treatments will get you control, but oftentimes it will only get you that season's control. If you start doing a couple seasons in a row of those late fall applications, you'll start to get periods of time where you wouldn't need to manage those cattails. And lotus and water lilies, I hope none of you are dealing with lotus in a small pond because they produce a lot of seed. They're incredibly hardy and they cause a lot of problems. They are, if you have a lotus in your pond, it's a leaf that either floats on the surface. It's the one on the far right here in the picture. Either floats on the surface or rises above the surface on the stem. It's a complete circle leaf. There's no split in the leaf. And it's, I mean, for size reference, you could wrap it around your head and make a hat out of it. A 5-gallon pail would fit on it. Water lilies, as that picture there in the middle, yellow or white water lilies are typically what we have here in Iowa. They'll have that split that makes them look almost like a Pac-Man on the water, and they're also a much smaller leaf. Both plants are controlled by a lot of the same chemical compounds. From the most inexpensive of a glyphosate, aquatic labeled glyphosate, your aquanites, your Roundup Customs. ClearCast can work on it a little bit to your more expensive products, for instance, Percellacor. But they are all manageable. Again, water lilies and lotus, I'd like to mention, you're going to be treating those a lot like your cattails, very similar. You're going to want to treat those later in the summer, early in the fall, same concept that you're doing with the cattails. All right, Tyler, next slide. All right, so algae, this will be kind of the last problematic aquatic. We always talk about it with plants, but it is its own thing. Algae management is typically always done with complex coppers. We can put copper into three different, I'm sorry, we can put algae into three different types of algae. There's multiple different species within each category I'm going to talk about here. Those aren't important for what we're talking about today, as long as we get it in the box of what you're dealing with. So filamentous algae is often what we consider mat forming. It's either on the bottom or it breaks loose at the bottom, comes to the top. It's a mat forming stringy algae. Your other is planktonic algae. This is what we would consider a bloom. It's also early in the year. Those blooms are very, very beneficial for fish. Young of the year fish eat zooplankton and phytoplankton. So planktonic blooms are important. However, they can become problematic if the bloom is the whole pond or a toxic bloom. And then we also have macroalgae. So macroalgae is what's been that bottom right there with the penny. That's a plant-like algae, and that is muskgrass. So we have muskgrass in Iowa. It looks a lot like a rooted aquatic plant. However, it is not. It is an algae. All three can be controlled with complex copper compounds. Next slide. So algae treatment options. So there are some products out on the market now. We have a couple different pond dyes. They're either black or blue. You can try to dye your pond to get that light transmission lessened, so you'll have less light available for algae species to grow. I put P mitigation on here. What that means is phosphorus mitigation. There's a lot of companies coming out now with really, really useful phosphorus mitigation products. And I think we're kind of in the infancy of some of these products being really used on wide scale and really widely available. But I think we have some options coming on board here in the next couple of years that would be very useful for small pond owners, that they could manage their phosphorus and potentially not be treating their plants all the time, or algae. And then there is mechanical removal. If you have filamentous algae floating, if you have muskgrass, those are algae that you could mechanically remove with a net. Obviously, planktonic algae is virtually impossible to mechanically remove. That phosphorus mitigation products, there's products coming out that will go in your incoming water, so near those inlets that would bond up with all that free phosphorus coming in. There's products that can go in and they're targeted to go down to the sediment to capture some of that legacy phosphorus that's in the sediment. And then there's also products to put in the water to gather some of that free phosphorus that's coming in on the sediment and with your rain events that's coming into your system. But ultimately, a lot of folks wind up going with the complex copper. Q-Trine Plus is a good all around. I threw up these numbers. You can go back and look at this presentation. I'm not going to go over. That's the low and the high that the label recommends. Q-Trine Plus is our old go-to tool. I would say anywhere you're using Q-Trine Plus, you can now switch to Captain XTR. It is a complex copper with the same use rates, but it has a surfactant in it that helps it penetrate those algae cells faster, so you'll get a much faster control with that Captain XTR, and often a longer term control. And then comine is an awful, it's a really good complex copper. And since I put the slide together, we have a new comine product available to us called Comine Descend. It's an incredibly broad spectrum copper complex that's really good for coontail management, but also its kind of number one use is for that filamentous algae. It does a really good job with filamentous algae, as Captain XTR. Filamentous algae would be where it struggles. Captain XTR is better with your planktonic algae and your early stage filamentous algae blooms. When you get into more filamentous algae, more abundance of it, your comine would be a better product. And that Comine Descend is a newer product that targets that filamentous algae mat on the bottom of the lake. It's a liquid application, but it sinks like a pellet, and then it goes down to the bottom of that lake and controls that matted out filamentous algae on the bottom of the pond. Next slide. All right, so I'm just going to throw up some helpful resources here. So Aquaplant, this is a Texas A&M website that is really, really useful for basic plant ID as well as management options. It gives you a list of excellent, good herbicides to choose based on your species that you're dealing with. Local application companies, there's many companies around Iowa that do private applications. And then local herbicide sales, your local ag suppliers often have access to some of these aquatic plants herbicides that we use. Some of the ID apps I want you to use caution with. Some of their plant ID, aquatic plant ID is not up to snuff, but they may be getting better as more people input pictures. But Seek, iNaturalist, EdMaps are a good place if you want to try to find some aquatic plant ID pictures. And the best ID book that we have available to us that we use here in the DNR is Through the Looking Glass. It's an ID book, I think published out of Wisconsin. And then some other helpful resources is, again, I can't stress enough how useful Google Maps is to, if you want to know how big your pond is, how much area you want to treat, being able to use those free polygon tools to map out your area is incredibly important. And then with that, I think, Tyler, I have my contact information on the last slide that you can capture. And if you have any issues with, I'm the aquatic veg management biologist for the state. If you have any issues about plant ID or you want to run some scenarios of what herbicides to use, I'd be happy to help. And with that, that's all I have.
All right, thanks, Jason.
Yep.
We do have quite a few questions about plants that we will get to soon. But first, I would like to give the floor to Jennifer, who's going to talk a little bit more about native plants and buffers.
Thank you, Cassie. I will get my screen shared. Oops. All right. Can you see that?
Looks good.
Okay, perfect. So we've been talking a lot about plants and we'll continue talking about plants, but let's talk about plants along the edge of your ponds and areas. So seeding native plants by a pond. One of my favorite topics. I enjoy working with native plants, and I think they have some really great appeal to be used in a lot of places that we're not using them right now. You know, they can look great and they can achieve a lot of things for us. We've been talking quite a bit about pond issues, pond edge issues. So here's a couple pictures to kind of give you an idea of some different ponds and pond edges. So the one on the left is actually an area that's been heavily predated by geese. They've been sitting around on it, and you can see that they're, you know, leaving a bunch of goose poop and making a mess. And they can really wreak havoc on water quality as well as just, you know, being messy, and they don't like the natives. So that's one good reason to take a look at, you know, if you have pond edge issues. You can also see some erosion in the middle picture, or in this particular picture, you can see they've used some erosion stone, but there's still that erosion along that interface. And so, you know, that's really where we can do a nice job with, you know, changing the vegetation into something a little bit different. And what we're talking about are Iowa's native prairie plants. They have deep root systems, which you can see here in that photo. They can go down 6 feet or more, you know, create some fibrous roots and really protect the soil and, you know, do a nice job. We live in a tall grass prairie ecosystem. And so these native plants, these species were here before European settlement. They thrive in Iowa's conditions, and they created the deep, rich soils that we have. And it includes many different grasses and flowers that can all be incorporated back along to your pond edges. really beautiful species that flower at many different times. So they also provide pollinator habitat and places where songbirds like to come. And it's a bit of a field of dreams. You build it and they will come kind of scenario that they just, a lot of our species are looking for what they knew to be here. So putting it back has a lot of good benefits. So here's a native pond edge. You can see there a lot of native species growing, and it provides a nice buffer for, ponds and lakes and wetlands and parks. Here's another one. This actually happens to be a forebay to a pond that was created, but you can see some species here, growing and blooming compared to just being native turf grass mowed down to the edge. So this will, capture a lot of that runoff for us. So I'm going to go through a little bit on kind of the quick overview of how you get from probably a turf grass or maybe a cool season brome stand into a native prairie. And we'll talk a little bit about agriculturally too. So one of the main things that needs to be done first in preparation is killing the existing vegetation. So that normally on the scale that we're likely talking about here is a glyphosate herbicide type application, and likely more than one application depending on what you're trying to kill. So I've had it in the past where somebody said, well, I mowed that area short and then I seeded it, but they seeded into a perennial plant community like an alfalfa or a grass. Well, you're not going to outcompete something that's already there established with roots. So one of the first things is, taking good care to kill it. There may be some tillage needed. What we want and what we desire is what we call a firm seed bed. Now, coming from, a stormwater background more recently, when I say firm seed bed, that's a little different thing in urban versus ag. So, in agricultural lands, you can have a very fluffy seed bed so that when you walk on it, it really squishes down a lot. And we want that to be firm, but we don't want bulldozer compacted type firm. That's too far. That we need to decompact so that the plants can actually grow. So something in between where you can get the good seed to soil contact. So one of the other main things that's a little different about this than say your regular turf grass or other seedings is there's really only one native seeding window that you seed in where the plants actually grow. A lot of the other ones are a dormant type seeding or a seeding to come up when conditions improve. So sometimes if in the spring, if we're like, oh, well, we missed it, we'll just seed it later. Well, you can do that, but then you have other management things you need to look at because you need that to stay in good shape all the way until basically the following May, at least, to where you're going to actually have some plants growing. So we really like to, there's different times of the year you can seed. You can seed dormant, which means generally in November, after the 15th, you don't want that seed to grow. You want it just to be out there and go through the winter and grow in the spring. You could also seed, early in the spring or so that it would come up when it starts to get good. So really the best time is, looking at when it's going to grow for this particular year would be doing it in the spring when conditions allow through around June 15th. You may get by a little bit later than that, and you may not on years like we've had now where they were just so dry. Because what we're really trying to do is we're trying to, get that seed to come up and grow enough so that it's sustainable by the time fall comes and winter comes and it dies back. So in your seeding options to get it out there, depending on the size of your area, would be seeding it by hand, using a broadcast seeder or, spreading it on top of the soil surface, or drilling right at the surface. So we need that good seed to soil contact, like I mentioned. And then in this case, we really need to talk about erosion protection. We need something. It might be disc anchored straw mulch. It might be a hydro mulch that gets blown on, or a rolled erosion control products. And we'll cover all these just a little bit more as we go forward. So taking a look at a case study of something that was seeded recently this is a stormwater pond. And I showed you the outlet, the multi-stage outlet picture from this pond. So you can see that in there, and you can see that the water level is 4 or 5 feet below where it would, the normal permanent pool would be. So in a case like this, we have some steep slopes that go down into that particular pond. So it's important that we do a good job with, all of our steps. And in this case, it was already bare. They did do some tillage because it was bare, but it was bulldozer bare. So tillage was needed to actually do some decompaction there. And once that was seeded, you can see this is actually a rolled erosion control product that was placed on top of the seed, so that you would have the seed to soil contact, but that you would keep that seed there so it wouldn't wash into the pond. And here it is with some growth happening. So, it's a multi-step and kind of a slow process to get from putting seed down to the aha moment of full establishment with native plants. So we'll talk a little bit about seedbed and planting. So I mentioned that you really need to control the existing vegetation. A lot of the time we're doing chemically controlled, and then we're doing some kind of tillage on top of that. Or in the case of, my case study right before, that had all been redone. So we didn't need to do chemical control. We just needed to do some tillage to create that firm seed bed. So once you have a firm seed bed, then, there's, you really, to get that firm seed bed, you either do some tillage to either decompact or create a nice seed bed, or about the only time that we're really no-tilling is, in general, if you're going back into a crop field, and best of all, if you're going back into soybean stubble. And the bottom picture here, that's a drill seeder, and that is going into soybean stubble. So nothing had to be done to get ready to plant, because the producer had been, doing maintenance to make it work good for soybeans. And that's a great start to go into a crop. Now, a lot of us might be looking at more of a cool season grass, and then we just do the chemically controlled, and, may or may not have to do tillage depending on what it looks like. So, getting that seed a 1/4 inch deep or less, especially if you're doing something like this drill, a lot of them need sunlight to come up. Or the upper picture is one, a Vicon, which is a broadcast seeder that flings a seed out and creates, more of a random pattern as opposed to seeding into rows. I mentioned erosion control options. I find that we're talking about seeding ponds. Ponds often have banks, and so it's really more important than other places to really look at what's our erosion control option. And so, hydro mulch would be one. That's the, spray on blue, green looking stuff that can help anchor things. I like it. It's a good product. I would highly recommend that you do your seeding first and put the seed down in one of those other methods, and then just hydro mulch over the top if you're going to. Don't try and mix the seeds into the hydro mulch, as it's just generally doesn't work quite as well to make sure you get everything spread the way you want. The other one might be a disc anchored straw mulch, where you spread the straw mulch out, but you run a disc over it to hold it in, because otherwise it's just going to blow away and not do what you want with it. Or what we call a erosion control product that you roll out like a mat over the top to kind of hold everything together. And on the steeper places in that upper picture, you can see that that's what's happening there. But you can even see a little bit of that soil from on top is, washing down onto the mat. So, it's things move, and that's pretty flat up there. So it's a good idea if you've got some slope and you're trying to protect a water source at the bottom side that you look into an erosion control option. The bottom picture shows the native plants coming up, and you can see there's quite a bit of open space in between them. That's kind of the way they work, especially because they get bigger and fill in those spaces somewhat over time. That, something like that's pretty cool. Now, this is the example where it was actually planted into soybean stubble. So, two things to notice: that because it was planted into soybean stubble and it's very flat, it wasn't as necessary to do that erosion control measure that it would be if you're looking at a pond edge. So you may have part of a site that needs something, and the rest of the site might be fine to leave either, bare because it already had some soybean stubble on it, or maybe do something simple like your straw mulch. So in this case, this was 1 month, and then on the left, and then 1 year after planting on the right. So you can see in the 1 month, you can start to see some of those rows where that seed was drilled in. And then a year later, you can see some of the early established species, and that's the flowers that are blooming. Now, in later years, it doesn't look all like one species, but that's a really good species to really, start out and provide some color and success, and to get people to go, oh, wow, look, they're doing something really interesting here, because you can get that blooming in that first year or two and look, very attractive. So let's talk about establishment maintenance. So unlike maybe grass seed, where maybe 6 weeks later, you're like, ta-da, native plants take a little bit longer. They establish and develop their roots first. And annual weeds, they grow fast and quickly to get up and to put the seed on so that they can reseed. So native plants cannot outcompete annual weeds during establishment in those first couple of years. So we really need to light the way for them by mowing to provide the sunlight that's needed for those natives to get their roots developed. So the other thing that does is, if you're in an area where people are watching or seeing what you're doing, is that you kind of keep it under the radar, so to speak, of it just looks green. It doesn't look like a weedy mess. You're not getting those annual weed seeds to put back down to compete with you later. So, mowing probably monthly during the first growing season is pretty critical, and mowing 6 inches high or so that you can allow those, baby natives to have enough top to build roots, not, scalping the area. So that is what it looks like for the first couple of years. And then long term, you're really looking at, if you can, doing some burn management. That is how the prairie grew up here. So that's what it knows. But you can simulate it with somewhat frequent, maybe every couple of years of a one-time mowing, and then treating the woody invasives. That's what you'll have, I'll say the most trouble with, is that those will start to come in if you're not doing some of those other treatments. And so it's a lot easier to take care of those when they're small and you can use a nippers, compared to when you need an army of strong people with chainsaws, and then you've got a lot of brush to haul out and deal with. There's a lot of resources to come up with some things, because, in the amount of time I have, I can't teach everything that you need to know to get a good seeding and all the nuance of it. But there's some really good information that we're putting together right now in the Iowa Stormwater Management Manual. The Native Landscaping chapter, which is chapter 11, is being updated as we speak. And in the next few months, will be going up on the website, and it will have a whole batch of seed mixes that you can use. And there's a lot of good technical guidance on the process of what to do, how to maintain it, all the different things you might want to know, whether it's, urban or ag. There's some really good information in there. Other places with some good resources would be the Tallgrass Prairie Center. They have a prairie seed calculator and create some seed mixes for you as well. And the Natural Resources Conservation Service is a wealth of information there in the Polk Soil, or the Soil and Water District, that just has a lot of good resources on, you know, what to plant, how to plant, when to plant. And so, you know, we'll get some of these resources in the information that gets back to you, so you know where to look for additional information on what to plant. Now, that being said, we really like to see, you know, in most places, a diverse mix of grasses and forbs or wildflowers in the mix, because then you've got some legumes, you've got more of a ecosystem, you know, pulled together. And the one nice thing about the Stormwater Management Manual and the seed mixes they're working on is that they have them laid out by, you know, wet versus dry, and how sunny it is, and then how tall of species you want. Now, that being said, we're a tall grass prairie areas, so the taller ones, you know, generally do better in most scenarios, but there's places and times that you might want or need something a little bit smaller. So that's some of the caveat on the resources and the seed, and how to choose the type of seed that you're looking for. The other thing might be to look at hiring an expert. We have a lot of contractors that specialize in seeding and maintaining natives. And, you know, we can help you find the appropriate one to kind of fit your system and space. The RAIN campaign has a section that talks about finding a landscaper or contractor, and they have a section that has native landscaping. And some of those are, you know, might be more for smaller sites, but many of them will do that on larger sites as well. There's also a spot on there to find a seed supplier. So if you're looking for those things, you know, the Soil and Water Districts can help, Natural Resources Conservation Service can help, or you can look on this website and find some of the contractors that do this work. We've had, you know, a lot more contracts lately when we're doing ponds and wetlands in urban settings, where they're breaking off the seeding and establishment and maintenance to a separate contractor, so that the earthwork contractor can move on to the next project, and somebody that really specializes in natives can come in and manage the site and get it to a place where it looks beautiful and it's a little bit easier to take forward from there. So that's always a really nice plan to pay some close attention with some expert help, whether you do it yourself and just get somebody to help you, or you hire an expert that knows something about natives to get you set and started the right way. Because it's not hard, but it's different, and it can be tricky. Sometimes you don't know what's important to deal with and what's not. And so people that have done it before can really help, you know, give you a leg up to achieve that pond buffer or native area that you're looking for, whether you want it for water quality purposes, or for wildlife, or enjoyment, or recreation, or even just to have a lower maintenance setting around your pond. It can be really attractive. And turn out to be something that, you know, is enjoyed by all. And just one last caveat is that it's not no maintenance. I think sometimes people thought, oh yeah, plant a prairie, you don't have to do anything. And it's not that, but it's certainly at my house, the ones I manage, it's a lot simpler and less time consuming than my turf grass. I deal with it basically once a season, maybe once every third season, and then it kind of just manages itself because I'm doing some regular maintenance. So once you get it going, it can be a really low maintenance and attractive and fun area to watch all the species develop over time, because, you know, they're gonna they're going to take their roots and create those the first year. The second year, they're going to really start coming along. And the third year, if you don't have, huge weed pressures or a huge drought, you're going to really start to see the stand coming on. And then a couple of years later, you might be really surprised at some new species that have just come from nowhere because they just take that much longer to grow up in there, and they form a really nice community that changes year to year depending upon the weather and moisture conditions, and can really be a nice buffer. So that's the slides that I brought, and Cassie, you can have it back until it's time for questions.
All right, thanks, Jennifer. We do have a few questions related to plants that we can go ahead and address right now, just so we get them related to the program. And then if anyone else comes up with any more questions about plants, we are going to have some time at the very end of the program to get all those other questions asked. So someone asked, would a good strategic location for native vegetation be at culverts or where water is flowing into a pond?
Yeah, that it certainly could, depending upon, can you get vegetation to grow there? Yes, that would be a nice buffer if it's not too much water that it can flow through the prairie, if you've got vegetation that's established there now, that could be a buffer. We look at trying to, when we talk about, say, a prairie buffer or a buffer that's linear, we're usually not talking about kind of a stream of water flowing through. We want to, make that water flow across the whole area if possible. But that's, something that certainly could be a place to begin to branch out with some natives.
All right, thanks. Can you use native prairie plants on an earthen dam?
Yes, you can use native prairie plants on an earthen dam. That shouldn't be a problem. One of the things that I've also seen, like septic systems and so forth, is that they actually use some drier land species on there, because then they're not seeking down to get into the water and cause problems. But we do plant natives on our dams.
Okay. And Jason, thanks for answering some of these questions in the chat. I'm just going to quickly read the question and answer. So for the people watching this later on the recording, they can get these questions answered as well. So Andy Kellner with the DNR is going to be presenting on wildlife issues in a couple minutes. So Andy, if you want to bring up your presentation, feel free.
Yeah,
so
I need, Jen, can you stop sharing so I can bring up my presentation, please?
Yep.
All right. So regarding floating plants, when do they flower? How do they spread? And where are their roots normally? Jason answered, most of these flower in mid to late summer and reproduce by seed and rhizome. And someone else asked, how long do you expect the land to lie dormant from an application of herbicide to kill off existing grasses before we can seed native plants? You want to try to take that one, Jen?
Sorry, I was muted. Okay, yeah. So when you're looking at killing species, sometimes it takes a couple applications to make sure that your cool season grasses are good and dead. It's much better to do an application and then you wait a few weeks and see things die, and you may need a second application. Sometimes you need a third application. Sometimes you even do something and then even wait another season. It's much better to make sure you have a really good kill on things that are going to persist in your landscape and start in a good place, because the natives take a while to get those roots going. So it's better to invest in, getting some of those harder to kill species gone prior to seeding.